Max Blumenthal from the Grayzone is with us. Hi, Max. How are you?
Hey, Jimmy. How you doing?
So I saw the Tucker Carlson segment he did on Monday, and I want to just go over it with you. You were there, right? You were there on January 6th, Max?
I was the Jewish QAnon alternative shaman.
So there's a lot of video that has been released to Tucker Carlson. He is the #1 news show in America, so why wouldn't you? So McCarthy, the speaker, the Republican speaker, now has gotten control of that stuff instead of the Democrats and Republicans establishment. Now they gave over having access to those tapes of what happened on January 6th. Now they gave him to Tucker Carlson, and here he makes his case that the January 6th committee is a bunch of liars who concocted a narrative.
If there's one takeaway from the corpus of footage that we spent 3 weeks looking at, it's that the January 6th committee lied. Its members are liars. And as the result of those lies, core civil liberties in this country were eroded. People went to prison. They're in prison as of right now, unjustly. So those lies had consequences.
So that's a big statement. That's the #1 newsman in America, or he's the host of the #1 news show in America. And I saw an article that said more Democrats watch Tucker Carlson in the demo than watch Rachel Maddow. So it's a very popular news show with Americans. And he just said everybody on the January 6th, one thing we know for sure is that they're all liars. That's the #1 news show, turning the narrative completely 180. And so here he is, he makes his case. This is his general point is that we've been lied to and only shown a sliver. And here's his case.
These are the pictures you've seen of January 6th. They're familiar because they've been playing on a loop on every media outlet in America for the last 2 years. There's a reason for that. But it turns out there's quite a bit of video you haven't seen. And that video tells a very different story about what happened on January 6th. More than 40,000 hours of surveillance footage from in and around the Capitol have been withheld from the public. And once you see the video, you'll understand why. Taken as a whole, the video record does not support the claim that January 6th was an insurrection. In fact, it demolishes that claim. And that's exactly why the Democratic Party and its allies in the media prevented you from seeing it. By controlling the images you were allowed to view from January 6th, they controlled how the public understood that day. They could lie about what happened, and you would never know the difference. Those lies had a purpose. They created a pretext for a federal crackdown on opponents of the Uniparty in Washington.
Our office wanted to ensure that there was shock and awe, that we could charge as many people as possible.
The first thing you notice,
and I just want to, this is probably going to seem outrageous to some people, but if Bernie Sanders became president, this is the exact kind of shit they would have did to him. They would have Russiagated him for 4 straight years, and then they would have made his followers look like violent insurrectionists, and they have to be shunned from polite society because they're the only people standing up against the Uniparty. That's what would have happened to Bernie Sanders.
He wasn't even president. They said his followers hate women.
They said his followers hate women. They said he hate women. They said he was a Russian. He was getting propped up by the Russians. Go, Max, you want to say something?
Remember the chair throwing incident in Nevada?
They made them out to be violent at a bullshit caucus in Nevada. They said that they were throwing chairs, and then senators from the Democratic Party were flipping them off, and they said they were doing that because they were being violent, which was all made up. They just made it up, just like this January 6th stuff is largely made up. Not all of it. There was some violence happening there, but watch what Tucker has to say.
Viewing the full video record of January 6th is just how many people entered the Capitol building that day. Hundreds and hundreds of people, possibly thousands, over the course of about 2 hours. The crowd was enormous.
Wow.
A small percentage of them were hooligans. They committed vandalism. You've seen their pictures again and again. But the overwhelming majority weren't. They were peaceful. They were orderly and meek. These were not insurrectionists. They were sightseers. Footage from inside the Capitol overturns the story you've heard about January 6th. Protesters queue up in neat little lines. They give each other tours outside the speaker's office. They take cheerful selfies and they smile. They're not destroying the Capitol. They obviously revere the Capitol. They're there because they believe the election was stolen from them. They believe in the system.
So now you're not allowed to believe that, and we're not allowed to say that on YouTube. We're not saying that the 2020 election was in any way anything but above board and perfect. But the 2016 election, you could say it was stolen, and any nefarious thing you want to say about it, it's okay because Donald Trump won. So you can say that all day long. In fact, they still say it, that it was a coup by the Russian government. That's what they say about 2016.
Can I say that George W. Bush stole it from Gore now that we like George W. Bush?
I'm not sure if you can say that either now. But anyway, so just so you know, those people, they were bad because they thought that the election was stolen from them. Now, when the Democrats, for the 4 years previous to them, thought the election was stolen from them, they were good. That's good. These people are bad for thinking the same thing. Okay, here we go.
Here's the man you've heard referred to as the QAnon shaman outside the Senate chamber. These are not rioters. These are people who wandered over from a political rally.
We will not let them silence your voices.
After the rally, they walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, where organizers had secured a federal permit to hold a legal rally on the grounds of the Capitol.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Once at the Capitol building, things began to get chaotic. Capitol police officers fired tear gas into the crowd. A few at the front of the herd broke windows. Someone opened the doors, and many hundreds of others just walked in.
They're going to make that the story.
Of course, they did make it the story. And at the center of it, the single most famous person arrested that day was a Navy veteran from Arizona called Jacob Chansley, often referred to as the QAnon shaman.
The so-called QAnon shaman. QAnon shaman.
Someone named Q Shaman.
Jacob Chansley became the face of January 6th, a dangerous conspiracy theorist dressed in outlandish costume who led the violent insurrection to overthrow American democracy. For these crimes, Chansley was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison, far more time than many violent criminals now receive. What did Jacob Chansley do to receive this punishment? To this day, there is dispute over how Chansley got into the Capitol building. But according to our review of the internal surveillance video, it is very clear what happened once he got inside. Virtually every moment of his time inside the Capitol was caught on tape. The tapes show that Capitol Police never stopped Jacob Chansley. They helped him. They acted as his tour guides. Here's video of Chansley in the Senate chamber. Capitol Police officers take him to multiple entrances and even try to open locked doors for him. We counted at least 9 officers who were within touching distance of unarmed Jacob Chansley. Not one of them even tried to slow him down. Chansley understood that Capitol Police were his allies. Video shows him giving thanks for them in a prayer on the floor of the Senate.
They opened the door for him.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building.
Contrast the reality of what Jacob Chansley did in the Capitol building on January 6th, the indisputable facts recorded on video, some of which has never before been seen, with the depiction of Jacob Chansley that you've seen in the media for more than 2 years. He's a terrorist, they said. He should be killed.
Shoot him. Shoot him. Like, you burst into the United States, if he was dressed like bin Laden, would you have shot him?
Shoot him. Shoot him. It makes you wonder, who are the violent extremists here? Not Jacob Chansley. And the video proves that. But you would never have known from the media coverage.
The people sitting in the chairs need to be sitting in a jail cell.
Chansley is in a jail cell. He's been there for months. If he was in fact committing such a grave crime, why didn't the officers who were standing right next to him place him under arrest? Until now, no one could even prove that even happened. But it did.
So let me bring in Max. So that story seemed very concocted. I've heard other things about that guy, that he was some kind of a religious peacenik. But again, let's remember, nobody had a gun. He thanked the cops right in there for letting them in, which we saw. We've seen videos of cops pulling back the gates, letting them in. And I'm going to show you more video coming up of cops talking about how they were abandoned by their superiors and they didn't give them any backup. And it all seems to be intentional. And so as if they wanted this to happen. So obviously they wanted this to happen. this is I'm speaking, and I'm going to show you video where the FBI won't tell you how many FBI undercover people they had in that crowd. So this was instigated by them, and that's what these videos are revealing, and that the story that they chose to tell, the January 6th committee, is a lie. Now, let me throw it over to you, Max. What do you have to say about this?
Well, Jacob Chansley says that he is a practitioner of ahimsa, which is an ancient Indian practice of nonviolence, and that he is religiously opposed to harming another person physically. And it's unclear, therefore, what he did to get more than 3 years in prison, except being one of the most visibly recognizable people to participate in the what's known as the Capitol riot, the January 6th protest. I saw him there. As you said, I was a witness to the events. I just went down as a reporter, and I just saw him walking around like he was at Burning Man. He was just being merry and taking photos with everyone. I didn't see him commit any acts of violence or vandalism. And as you can see, he was ushered around the building by Capitol Police. He's since been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia in prison. This didn't factor into the extreme sentence he got. And I really recommend that everyone read Chris Hedges' piece, which is up at ScheerPost, called Lynching the Deplorables. And it's about how the 9/11 model that was applied to Muslims and Muslim Americans, including many Muslim American civil society leaders who were arrested and raided after 9/11 under orders from John Ashcroft, is now in many ways being applied to these kind of right-wing Americans and Americans affiliated with the pro-Trump and January 6th movement. And the treatment of them in DC jail and in prison is horrendous. I mean, we're talking about solitary confinement. Many of them during the COVID lockdowns were kept in their cells for 23 hours a day. One had his face literally broken in a beating by a prison guard. And the sentencing a lot of it is based on the propaganda we've seen from the January 6th committee, where they poison all the jury pools in DC. I mean, if you know how the DC jury pools work, it's like liberals and people who work for the CIA or CIA contractors are disproportionately represented there, and they think of these people as terrorists because of the perception. So I think it is important to present a more full perspective on what happened, because what I saw take place there was much more complex than the version that the January 6th committee, which didn't even have a real Republican counterpoint or counterpoint at all, critical counterpoint, has presented.
Well, they did have Liz Cheney. And
yeah, exactly. Who just got a job at University of Virginia through Larry Sabato, who's a Democratic pundit hack.
So, and Tucker's going to talk about this, how this reveals the uniparty, this January 6th commission, this January 6th narrative that has been cooked up by the establishment. And just like we had that I'm blanking on the guy's name who was the economic professor who had the Scottish accent we brought on. And Mark Blythe, thank you. And he coined the term global Trumpism, right? I think that was the term. And he said, Trump isn't a local event. And that Brexit was the same thing. It represented the same thing as Trump's election here in the United States, was regular people using the ballot box to express their disdain for the establishment. It wasn't that they necessarily even wanted Brexit. It wasn't even necessarily that they wanted Trump, but they wanted to stick their thumb in the eye of the establishment in some way. And they did. And so this January 6th psyop that was largely manufactured, and I'm going to get to by the intelligence community, like they do all this stuff, was there to make MAGA and Trump and his followers unacceptable in polite society. Like they were going to be, and they would have did this to Bernie Sanders and his followers. They started to do it, but Bernie Sanders never grabbed power, and because he was afraid of just this thing. And so now here Tucker's going to make his case of how they lied. Even more so. Boy, that was amazing with that guy. So that guy's sitting in prison for at least 3 years. I heard it was 4.
I didn't know what he even did before this.
What did he do? And so if the cops are opening the door, Tucker make the point. He goes, hey, if a cop opens the door to a liquor store and then you go in and you steal the cash and then they let you back out, isn't the cop complicit in that crime? How are those cops not complicit in this crime with this? What crime did he commit? I don't know. He had a horrible lawyer. Maybe he made bad decisions because he's bipolar, and that's why he got such a bad. He pled guilty to something he probably shouldn't have. But Max, what do you say?
Well, there's one guy who was sentenced to over 7 years, and he didn't even enter the Capitol building, Guy Wesley Reffitt. And one of the charges he faced was obstruction of justice because he allegedly threatened his teenage sons against reporting him to law enforcement because he was afraid of going to jail. So 1,000 people have been arrested and taken in this case, and many of them did not enter the building.
So now Tucker's going to let you know this is his big idea here. He's going to lay down his case of how they lied.
Take away from the corpus of footage that we spent 3 weeks looking at, it's that the January 6th committee lied. Its members are liars. And as the result of those lies, core civil liberties in this country were eroded. People went to prison. They're in prison as of right now, unjustly. So those lies had consequences. So you have to ask yourself, whatever happened to the members of the January 6th committee? These liars who hurt people and the country. Well, let's see. Adam Schiff is running for Senate. Adam Kinzinger got a job at CNN. Liz Cheney somehow wound up a professor at the University of Virginia, the August University of Virginia. They're all still there. Benny Thompson. Ooh, listen to his wisdom. But they're liars. And above all, this video proves it. Here's another installment. One of the enduring mysteries of January 6th is the role that intelligence and law enforcement agencies played in the events of that day. We know there was some number of undercover federal agents in the crowd at the Capitol. Officials have since admitted that under oath. But what exactly were they doing there? The January 6th committee worked hard to hide the answer to that question. We do know from contemporaneous videotape that a mysterious figure called Ray Epps encouraged the crowd to go into the Capitol. For some reason, Epps has never been indicted for that. But there's no question he did it.
We need to go into the Capitol!
Under public pressure,
So now that guy was a Fed. So that guy's what they call an undercover Fed. And he was there to instigate that riot. And he did. And we've showed you this guy many times. Now, the heads of the FBI were asked about this guy, and they said, we can't answer any questions. They said that to senators. So I just want to let you know about that guy. Okay.
January 6th committee finally interviewed Ray Epps. Epps told the committee that he never entered the Capitol and therefore never committed a crime. His text messages showed that at 2:12 p.m., he boasted to his nephew that he had, quote, orchestrated the protests at the Capitol. He admitted he helped get people there. Yet, curiously, congressional Democrats consider Ray Epps an ally, not an insurrectionist. Tonight, we can tell you that at the very least, Ray Epps lied in his sworn testimony to the January 6th committee. Epps testified that when he sent the text messages to his nephew, he had already left the Capitol grounds to return to his hotel room.
That's a lie.
That is not true. The surveillance footage we found shows that, in fact, Ray Epps remained at the Capitol for at least another half an hour. You're seeing that on your screen now. What was Epps doing there? We can't say, but we do know that he lied to investigators. The January 6th committee likely knew this too. Democrats had access to the same tape, yet they defended Ray Epps. No honest investigation would do that. But the point of the January 6th committee was never to investigate anything. The point was to stage a made-for-TV show trial.
Now, I've been making this point here at that show that this is a show trial, and that I've been saying the same thing on stage. And that's exactly what this is. This is a concocted show trial, and here we go.
Opening moments, the tone of the hearings was almost comically overheated and polemical. There was not a tragedy in American history that Democrats didn't liken to the protests of January 6th.
I'm from a part of the country where people justified the actions of slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and lynching.
How staged and fraudulent was the work of the January 6th committee? Democrats hired a Good Morning America producer called James Goldston to dramatize the footage they released.
They hired a television producer to make the video more dramatic. They're putting on a show.
Dubbed in audio to make the pictures more sensational, as in a docudrama. The networks carried it all live as if it were real. But Donald Trump was far from the only target.
The enemy is within the House of Representatives.
Within hours of January 6th, Democrats alleged a conspiracy. They claimed their Republican colleagues had helped to plan the breach of the Capitol building. There was never any evidence this was true, none at all, yet it was widely repeated.
Our colleagues are continuing to engage with white nationalist extremist groups, the most violent attack on the Capitol since the War of 1812.
At one point, the January 6th committee publicly accused Republican Congressman Barry Laudermilk of Georgia of leading a reconnaissance mission through the Capitol building the day before.
They were looking for some member of Congress that was involved in all this.
The surveillance tape that we reviewed shows this story is a lie, and the Democrats on the committee knew it was a lie when they told it. The so-called reconnaissance mission Democrats alleged was nothing more than Congressman Laudermilk giving a guided tour to his constituents from Georgia, none of whom were, quote, insurrectionists. Laudermilk didn't even take the group inside the Capitol building. They walked through a congressional office building down the street.
The FBI totally cleared them. The committee knew this before they actually made their accusations against me. It wanted to create this story that would, fit where they wanted the evidence to lead.
Despite the video evidence they possessed proving it wasn't true, the committee included the lie in its final report. Protesters, it says dramatically, quote, took a tour of the Capitol with Representative Barry Laudermilk, during which he took pictures of hallways and staircases.
If you read the final report, it was a manifesto against Donald Trump. That's all it was.
When the committee wasn't accusing Republican office holders of planning riots on January 6th, it was accusing them of running away from those riots like cowards. In the case of Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, the committee and their allies accused him of both.
Josh Hawley is a
To prove that Josh Hawley was a coward, the committee released video of him loping out of the building on the afternoon of January 6th with a police escort. The tape became a staple on social media. Democrats laughed with derision.
Later that day, Senator Hawley fled after those protesters he helped to rile up stormed the Capitol. See for yourself.
But
they didn't show the whole video. Here's the part they didn't show.
The surveillance footage we reviewed shows that famous clip was a sham, edited deceptively by the January 6th committee. The clip was propaganda, not evidence. The actual videotape shows that Hawley was one of many lawmakers being ushered out of the building by Capitol Hill police officers. And in fact, Hawley was at the back of the pack. The coward tape was a lie, one of many from the January 6th committee. One of many is for certain. Thomas Massie serves in the Congress.
So it's a bigger deal than I think people are realizing, because they've tried to marginalize Tucker Carlson so much, and yet he's still the #1 news show in America. And for him to be doing this is got to be panicking the people in power. And the big question is, all Tucker Carlson had to do was look at the videotape, and he could see immediately, his staff could see immediately they were lying. They concocted a narrative, and they lied all these different ways. And there's more ways to show you, way more ways. They lied that a cop got killed. The cop didn't get killed. They lied and said he did. We're going to show you that. But the question is, to me, Max, why are they lying? And of course, the obvious answer would be because they're concocting a story, and this was their chance to get rid of Donald Trump and his followers forever. And that's what this was, and they wanted to concoct this. And this isn't something... Go ahead. Let me just throw it to you there.
Yeah, it's a lot like Russiagate, except there is a certain reality there. There was a riot. I call it a low IQ riot that lasted for several hours, and then the crowd was pretty much dispersed once the police arrived on January 6th. So that was real. Russiagate was fake, but Russiagate had a dual-pronged purpose that converged inside the Beltway Uniparties. The purpose was, one, a partisan purpose. Clintonite dead enders wanted to delegitimize Trump's presidency, and then you had the convergence or the confluence with the national security, anti-Russia fanatics, the spooks like John Brennan. So here you have the same thing. The FBI wants to expand its powers massively, and the Capitol Police want to justify their bureaucratic priorities. They've been able to expand to 2 field offices thousands of miles away from D.C. since January 6th. Their budget is ballooned. And then you have, the January 6th committee. That was just a partisan show to try to destroy what's left of Donald Trump, and possibly, they had their criminal referral. They want to prosecute him so he can never run for president again. That's why they're doing this.
Why they're doing this.
Why is Tucker doing this? Maybe there's a partisan motivation there. Obviously, it's Fox News. Tucker's, the leading voice of MAGA. But, there are also civil liberties issues in play that run counter to those of the FBI. So if you look at the way I watched the 2 nights so far of Tucker's coverage, and I've been watching MSNBC's coverage and some of CNN's, and it's all uniform. They start out every hour by denouncing Tucker for claiming that January 6th was a mostly peaceful event, a kind of like Woodstock type festival. No. And they completely, they render his critique into a cartoon of what it's not. And, if you actually watch it, Tucker is showing riot footage. He's acknowledging that there was violence there. But what he's doing is poking holes in the January 6th investigation with all of this footage. And one of the most interesting interviews he conducted was with Representative Thomas Massie, the libertarian from Kentucky, who said, as a member of Congress, my security is not threatened by releasing all of this footage after, the proper vetting and letting the public see it all to make up their minds. And that would, what would be wrong with that if it is such a heinous event? And I do think in many ways it was disgraceful what took place, and stupid. And it was also a security state trap. But let's see it all, and let's find out potentially who the federal infiltrators actually were. I think there's a cover-up taking place there. That's why there was so little interest in Ray Epps. We also have to ask why Ray Epps wasn't the only person who someone actually took a bullhorn and stood up in front of their followers and said, break through the barricades and disregard the police. And that was the Groypers leader, the Nazi catboy, Nick Fuentes, the guy who's advising Kanye's Ye's presidential run. And then he went and had lunch at a Japanese steakhouse, as Anya Parampil reported at the Grayzone. I think she's the only reporter who noticed this. Nick Fuentes was never arrested, just like Ray Epps was kind of left alone when these were key instigators. It's really unusual.
Know he did that.
So now,
yeah, and like why don't we constantly see that video?
And
the video's out there.
They trash him too, and they don't show that.
Yeah,
and so
interesting.
Matt,
so
you know that story that Chris Hedges told on my show, and I think it was in Henry Kissinger's book or something about when the anti-war protesters were outside the White House and they had lined up school buses inside the fence, and Henry Kissinger looks out the window and he says to Henry Kissinger, "What are those buses there for?" He said, "Oh, because that they're there in case they break through the fence, you know." And he was like, "Oh, I'm afraid." And he said something like, "Well, I'm afraid they'll come for me. And if they get through the fence, they'll come for me." And Chris Hedges says that's exactly where we want them. So how do you reconcile what that story and Chris Hedges saying that with what you just said about January 6th, the protesters?
Well, the current incarnation of the U.S. left would never do something to make people in power feel threatened. Although we are seeing in Atlanta some interesting events that I think tie into January 6th. Okay, you had all of these January 6th defendants accused of seditious conspiracy, in other words, conspiracy to overthrow the government, including the Proud Boys and Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers. The New York Times itself has acknowledged that there is no evidence in 50,000 text messages and emails involving the Oath Keepers to build a case that they were actually trying to overthrow the U.S. government and violently install Donald Trump. But all these sedition charges appear to be sticking. The government is inventing and expanding these World War I era laws to apply to common rioters. And we're seeing the same thing in Atlanta with protesters against Cop City, this gigantic police complex that's taking out an old growth forest. What's known as Antifa has been protesting it along with lots of activists there. And a lot of those protesters, several of them are being accused of terrorism. They're facing literal terrorism charges for their role. So the way that the federal government, from Merrick Garland, but particularly Merrick Garland, but from Merrick Garland down to, federal prosecutors is behaving is outlandish in the way that they're applying these charges. And so it can apply to the left, and it's happening before our eyes.
If you want to see my stand-up special, become a member at jimmydore.com. It's only $10, and come see our live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, St. Paul, Honolulu, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, and more.